Troy, do you ever get sad?
I do get sad sometimes, Guyton.
Do you ever get a little depressed?
Well, it just depends on what's happening in my life, but I suppose, yes.
You know, I do too, and I think it's important before we start this question. I normally put something funny at the beginning. I want to use the opportunity to just say that depression and clinical depression is very real. And I realize if you're watching this show right now that maybe you're struggling through some of that, but I want you to know that there is hope and there are ways to resolve that. And if you ever you're struggling with that, reach out through our program and get in contact with us so that we can try and help you with whatever it is that you are facing. But the question that came in is, I suffer from depression. Since Jesus told us, do not be troubled, is my depression a sin? And so I want to answer that very specifically with a very clear answer, is that someone suffering from depression, it doesn't mean that you're in sin. And in fact, by this specific verse, John chapter 14, verse 1, that's actually really not the context of what he is talking about. And there are other passages that we can talk about dealing with depression, but John 14, verse 1 is actually very specific about an event that's about to take place.
Yes. In fact, Jesus is on his way over to the Garden of Gethsemane, and the disciples are concerned about what's happening, and they're not understanding because, we have hindsight vision to be able to look back and see what's happening. They didn't. And so he said, don't let your heart be troubled. And then he says, I go to prepare a place for you, and those sort of things. Back
up to verse 37 of chapter 13. Peter said unto him, Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I'll lay down my life for your sake. And so you see his urgency, his desire to go with him. And Jesus has already told him, you can't follow me. And so
not where I'm going.
So chapter 14, verse 1, he's saying, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And what a beautiful verse. We got to read it. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. If I go to prepare a place, I'll come again. And so what he's telling them is, don't be troubled because we're about to separate. This separation is just something temporary. And I've got a place for you that you will one day be.
Yes, and for those that are suffering from depression, I want you to know that the scriptures also are the place of comfort. I mean, 1 Corinthians 1:3 tells us that God is a God of all comfort. We also know that we can cast all of our burdens on Jesus. He says that in Matthew 11, verse 28. We've got other versions or other verses that we could go to, like 1 Peter 5, that tells us to cast all our burdens on him. The only time that something like depression or anything turns into a sin is whenever you take everything out of God's hands. Whenever you start worrying, just like Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verse 25, he says, and which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? Worry and depression are not necessarily the same thing. They're very separate.
They are. And one of the things I like to remember is that even great men of faith were depressed. They worried and struggled at times.
Elijah.
That's exactly where I was going to go. Under the juniper tree, he was ready. He was just, God, let me die now. And so he was at a state of depression at that point, and it wasn't sin. That was that human weakness. Now, will Satan use depression to try and tear you away from God?
He sure will.
He will. And that's why we need to turn to scriptures, sometimes good biblical counseling, sometimes getting to a doctor to find out is the depression being caused because of hormonal or vitamin imbalances. And that's why I'm saying, if you're suffering from it, please reach out to us and we can help you biblically and point you in the right direction medically. But John chapter 14 isn't dealing with depression. John chapter 14 is dealing with, they were worried about being without Jesus. But they needed to understand that they're never without Jesus Christ, because he hears, he sees everything. He's ruling over his kingdom today, and he's at the right hand of God right now, preparing a place that one day we can be with him eternally in the presence of God.
Amen.